The Korean War. You think it ended in 1953, right? Parades, soldiers coming home, mission accomplished. But what if I told you that war never actually ended? Even today, 28,000 American active duty soldiers are still stationed in South Korea. The so-called armistice? It wasn't peace, it was just a pause. Here's the shocking truth. Korea was the first war America fought not to win, but simply not to lose. And that changes everything. Because once you understand Korea, you'll see how it shaped Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, every endless war that followed. June 25, 1950, North Korean tanks roll across the 38th parallel. Within hours, they're crushing South Korean defenses and racing towards Seoul. President Harry Truman faces a choice that will haunt American foreign policy for decades. This wasn't supposed to be America's fight. Korea had been split after World War II as a temporary measure. Soviets controlling the North, Americans the South. But when North Korean leader Kim Il-sung launched his invasion, Truman saw something bigger, the first test of communist expansion in the Cold War era. The trap was brilliantly set. Stalin had given Kim the green light for invasion, but promised no direct Soviet involvement. Mao's China seemed focused on internal rebuilding after their civil war. From Moscow's perspective, it was perfect. Let the Americans get bogged down in an Asian land war, while Soviets could claim plausible deniability. Truman took the bait. Within days, American forces were rushing to Korea under the banner of United Nations peacekeeping. But this wasn't really a UN operation. It was an American war wearing international clothing. 15 other nations contributed troops, but Americans would do most of the fighting and all of the dying. General Douglas MacArthur, the hero of World War II, was put in command. MacArthur had spent 5 years rebuilding Japan and saw himself as America's Emperor of Asia. He looked at the North Korean invasion and saw an opportunity to prove that communist expansion could be stopped with overwhelming American firepower. The early months seemed to prove MacArthur right. After initial setbacks, his brilliant Incheon landing in September 1950 cut North Korean supply lines and sent their army fleeing back across the 38th parallel. Seoul was liberated. The invasion had been reversed. But then MacArthur made the decision that turned a limited police action into a global crisis. Instead of stopping at the 38th parallel, the original border, he convinced Truman to let him pursue the retreating North Koreans all the way to the Chinese border. The goal shifted from defending South Korea to reunifying the entire peninsula under American control. MacArthur promised Truman that Chinese intervention was impossible. The Chinese, he declared, lack the air power to make any serious intervention. He told Congress that American forces would be home by Christmas. MacArthur was about to learn that overconfidence kills more armies than enemy bullets. Because 300 miles north of the 38th parallel, 200,000 Chinese soldiers were quietly moving into position. Mao had been sending warnings through diplomatic channels for months. Cross into North Korea, and China would enter the war. American intelligence ignored every signal. They convinced themselves that China was bluffing, that Mao wouldn't risk confrontation with American air power. They believed their own propaganda about Chinese weakness and American invincibility. The Chinese weren't bluffing. They were preparing for what they called the war to resist American aggression, and they were about to teach the American military a lesson about the limits of technological superiority. November 1st, 1950. Chinese forces launched their first attack against American troops near the Chongchon River. But this wasn't the massive invasion MacArthur expected. It was a limited engagement that seemed designed to test American responses. After inflicting casualties and capturing prisoners, the Chinese mysteriously withdrew. MacArthur convinced himself this proved Chinese weakness. The Chinese have shown their hand, he told Washington. They lack the will for sustained combat against American forces. He couldn't have been more wrong. The Chinese were using a strategy as old as Sun Tzu: appear weak when you are strong. While MacArthur celebrated his supposed victory, 300,000 Chinese troops were moving into position for the real attack. November 25, 1950. The nightmare began. In what became known as the Second Phase Offensive, Chinese forces launched coordinated attacks along the entire front. American units that had been advancing confidently toward the Yalu River suddenly found themselves surrounded by enemies who had appeared from nowhere. The Chinese fought differently than any army Americans had faced. They moved at night to avoid American air power. They used human wave attacks that overwhelmed American positions through sheer numbers. They employed tactics that prioritized psychological impact over military efficiency. Horns, whistles, and sudden appearances that terrorized American soldiers. Within 72 hours, the longest retreat in American military history had begun. The 8th Army, which MacArthur had claimed was the finest military force in the world, was fleeing in panic towards Seoul. Equipment was abandoned. Supply lines collapsed. Entire units disintegrated under Chinese pressure. The human cost was staggering. At the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, 30,000 United Nations troops found themselves surrounded by 120,000 Chinese soldiers in temperatures reaching minus 30 degrees. What followed was a fighting withdrawal that lasted 2 weeks and cost thousands of lives. Marine Colonel Louis Chesty Puller captured the American mindset when he told his men, "We're not retreating, we're just advancing in a different direction." But everyone knew the truth. America's most advanced military was being defeated by an army that moved on foot and fought with bolt-action rifles. MacArthur's response to this disaster revealed everything wrong with American strategic thinking. Instead of accepting that he had misunderstood Chinese resolve, he demanded escalation. He wanted to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria. He proposed using nuclear weapons against Chinese cities. He suggested arming Taiwanese forces for an invasion of mainland China. In other words, MacArthur wanted to turn a regional conflict into World War III. His logic was simple. If American conventional forces couldn't win in Korea, then America should use every weapon in its arsenal. The idea of accepting limited defeat was unthinkable. President Truman faced an impossible choice. He could escalate to nuclear warfare and risk global catastrophe, or he could accept something no American president had ever accepted: a military stalemate against a supposedly inferior enemy. The Chinese had taught America a lesson that would echo through every subsequent conflict. Technological superiority means nothing if your enemy is willing to accept casualties you cannot imagine. Advanced weapons are useless if your opponent controls when and where battles occur. But the most important lesson was psychological. For the first time in American history, overwhelming military power had failed to produce victory. The myth of American invincibility, built through 2 world wars, was shattered in the mountains of North Korea. MacArthur never understood this lesson. He continued demanding escalation until Truman finally fired him in April 1951. The general who had promised victory was relieved of command for insubordination, ending his career in disgrace. But the damage was done. America had learned that modern warfare against determined enemies might not have clear endings. Sometimes the best you could hope for was not losing too badly. April 1951. General Matthew Ridgway replaced MacArthur with a completely different philosophy. Where MacArthur had promised total victory, Ridgway offered something new in American military doctrine: acceptable stalemate. Ridgway understood what MacArthur never grasped. This wasn't World War II. There would be no unconditional surrender, no victory parades, no clear ending. The goal was to inflict enough casualties on Chinese and North Korean forces to convince them that continued fighting wasn't worth the cost. This was the birth of limited war doctrine. America would fight with enough force to avoid defeat, but not enough to risk nuclear escalation. They would accept territorial stalemate in exchange for avoiding global catastrophe. Victory became redefined as not losing too badly. The new strategy worked, sort of. By summer 1951, fighting had stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel where it had started. Both sides were exhausted. The Chinese had learned that American air power made large-scale offensives prohibitively expensive. Americans had learned that Chinese ground forces made territorial conquest impossible. But here's where the Korean experience became the template for every future American conflict. Nobody knew how to end it. Armistice negotiations began in July 1951 and dragged on for 2 years. The fighting continued during these peace talks, with both sides using violence to improve their negotiating positions. Americans died in battles for hills that would be abandoned the next week. The war had become performance art, deadly theater designed to influence diplomatic conversations. President Eisenhower, who took office in 1953, inherited this mess with a promise to end Korean fighting. His solution revealed how fundamentally Korea had changed American strategic thinking. Instead of seeking victory, Eisenhower threatened massive nuclear retaliation unless China agreed to armistice. It was nuclear blackmail, pure and simple. America couldn't win conventional victory in Korea, so they threatened to destroy China if fighting continued. The implicit message was clear. America would rather risk global nuclear war than accept obvious military defeat. The threat worked. An armistice was signed July 27, 1953. But notice what it was called. An armistice, not a peace treaty. Technically, the Korean War never ended. It was simply paused indefinitely. This created the template for American Cold War strategy. When conventional military force couldn't produce clear victory, America would maintain indefinite military presence and threaten nuclear escalation to prevent defeat. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't defeat either. The human cost of this success was staggering. 36,000 Americans dead, 100,000 wounded, and millions of Korean and Chinese casualties. All to maintain a divided peninsula that remains divided today. But the strategic cost was even higher. Korea taught American policymakers that modern warfare might not have clear endings. Sometimes the best outcome was permanent military commitment to prevent your opponent from winning. This lesson would shape every subsequent American conflict. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, all followed the Korean pattern of initial optimism, unexpected resistance, tactical stalemate, and indefinite military presence justified by fear of what might happen if America withdrew. Korea didn't just change how America fought wars, it changed what America thought winning meant. 70 years later, those 28,000 American troops are still in South Korea. 3 generations of American families have served tours defending the same line that was established in 1953. The temporary armistice has lasted longer than the Roman Empire. But Korea's real legacy isn't those troops. It's the strategic template it created for every American conflict since. Vietnam followed the Korean pattern exactly. Initial intervention to stop communist expansion, optimistic predictions of quick victory, unexpected enemy resistance that conventional American firepower couldn't overcome. Gradual escalation followed by stalemate, political promises that victory was just around the corner. Finally, withdrawal disguised as strategic success. Iraq repeated the same cycle. Quick military victory against conventional forces, followed by insurgency that American technology couldn't defeat. Years of military presence justified by fear of what might happen if America left. Political rhetoric about democracy and freedom masking the reality of indefinite occupation. Afghanistan was Korea in the mountains. 20 years of military presence, trillions of dollars spent, thousands of American lives lost, all to prevent the Taliban from controlling territory they eventually controlled anyway. The pattern is always identical because Korea taught American policymakers the wrong lesson. Instead of learning that limited military force couldn't achieve unlimited political objectives, they learned that indefinite military presence could prevent obvious defeat. Korea created the illusion that stalemate was strategy. That permanent military commitment was the same thing as victory. That threatening escalation could substitute for achieving objectives. But here's the devastating truth about Korea's legacy. Every limited war since 1953 has ended the same way. American withdrawal followed by the victory of whatever forces America had been fighting. North Vietnam won in 1975. The Taliban won in 2021. ISIS controlled territory for years despite American bombing. The pattern is consistent because the underlying problem remains unchanged. Military force alone cannot achieve political transformation. Korea should have taught America that some conflicts don't have military solutions. That indefinite commitment to prevent defeat is not the same as achieving victory. That threatening escalation eventually becomes meaningless if you're never willing to follow through. Instead, Korea taught American policymakers that they could fight forever without winning, as long as they avoided losing too obviously. Korea was supposed to prove that American power could stop communist expansion anywhere in the world. Instead, it proved that American power had limits that technology couldn't overcome. The war that never ended became the template for wars that couldn't be won. Korea taught America to fight not for victory, but simply to avoid the appearance of defeat. And that's why those 28,000 troops are still there today. Not because Korea was successful, but because America never learned how to define success in ways that conflicts could actually end. The Korean War didn't end in 1953. It just taught America how to lose gracefully, over and over again, for the next 70 years.